Ma'am, you cannot display a 40-foot billboard of women's undergarments visible from the interstate without proper municipal permits. The city inspector's voice cracked as he stared up at my grandmother's vintage bloomers fluttering against the morning sky. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. 6 months earlier, I had been Sarah Martinez, a 34-year-old marketing coordinator who believed in community guidelines and neighborhood harmony. I paid my HOA dues on time, attended the quarterly meetings, and even volunteered for the annual spring cleanup. My biggest rebellion was occasionally parking my Honda Civic 3 inches over my driveway line. But sometimes the most ordinary people are pushed too far by the most extraordinary tyrants. Sometimes a load of laundry becomes a declaration of war. And sometimes the woman who thinks she owns your neighborhood discovers that property rights work both ways. Where are you watching from today? I hope you're somewhere with a clothesline, because after you hear this story, you're going to want to hang every piece of fabric you own outside just to spite the nearest HOA president. It started on a Tuesday morning in March when I made the catastrophic mistake of hanging my grandmother's quilts outside to dry. The sun was streaming through the oak trees that lined Maple Street, casting those long golden shadows that make you remember why you moved to a place called Maplewood Estates in the first place. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and possibility, and I was feeling particularly domestic after spending the weekend sorting through my grandmother's things. She'd passed the month before, leaving me her house, her recipes, and a collection of handmade quilts that had been gathering dust in her cedar chest for 40 years. These weren't just any quilts. My grandmother, Elena Rodriguez, had been what polite people called eccentric and what honest people called completely unhinged. She'd spent the 1970s traveling through Europe in a converted school bus, collecting fabrics from tiny villages and learning embroidery techniques from women whose names she could never pronounce. The quilt I hung that Tuesday morning was her masterpiece, a riot of purple and gold florals that looked like a garden had exploded across vintage cotton, with intricate stitching that formed the words "Live Free or Die Trying" in elaborate cursive across the center. I should have known Diane Blackthorne would have something to say about it. Diane had been the HOA president of Maplewood Estates for 8 years, which in suburban politics is roughly equivalent to being a small-town dictator with excellent landscaping. She was 53 years old, 5 foot 2 inches of compressed authority, with the kind of blonde highlights that cost more than most people's car payments, and the dead-eyed stare of a woman who had never met a rule she couldn't weaponize. She lived in the largest house on the cul-de-sac, a sprawling colonial with marble columns that she'd had installed specifically because the Architectural Review Committee had strongly discouraged ornamental columns that serve no structural purpose. When you're the Architectural Review Committee, apparently you can discourage yourself right into a classical Greek revival fantasy. The HOA of Maplewood Estates had exactly 47 pages of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which Diane had memorized like scripture. She knew every subsection about fence heights, every clause about appropriate mailbox materials, and every single restriction about exterior displays that may negatively impact neighborhood aesthetic standards and property values. She had successfully fined residents for wind chimes that were excessively melodious, garden gnomes that were inappropriately festive, and Halloween decorations that remained visible past November 2nd. But she had never encountered my grandmother's quilts. I was inside making coffee when I heard the sharp rap of knuckles against my front door. Not the friendly tap-tap-tap of a neighbor dropping by to borrow sugar, but the authoritative knock-knock-knock of someone who expected immediate compliance. When I opened the door, Diane stood on my porch in her morning power outfit. Black athleisure pants, a white zip-up jacket, and tennis shoes that had never seen a tennis court. Her blonde hair was pulled back in what I can only describe as a speak-to-the-manager ponytail, and she held her phone in one hand like she was already documenting our conversation for legal purposes. "Good morning, Sarah," she said, though her tone suggested the morning was anything but good. "I need to speak with you about your outdoor display." I followed her gaze to my clothesline, where my grandmother's quilt hung like a flag of independence against the suburban sky. "My laundry?" your violation of Section 4.3.2 of the Community Covenants." She tapped her phone screen and began reading in the kind of monotone voice that suggested she'd given this speech before. "No exterior displays, decorations, or installations shall be erected, placed, or maintained on any lot which, in the reasonable discretion of the Architectural Review Committee, may negatively impact neighborhood aesthetic standards, property values, or the general visual harmony of the community." You will not believe what she tried next. Diane stepped closer to my door, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixing with the unmistakable scent of suburban entitlement. Furthermore, Section 2.1.7 specifically prohibits any resident from hanging laundry, linens, or clothing items visible from public areas or neighboring properties between the hours of sunrise and sunset. I blinked at her. "Are you telling me I can't hang my laundry outside?" "I'm informing you that your current display constitutes a violation of established community standards." She switched to her phone's camera and began photographing my grandmother's quilt from multiple angles like she was documenting evidence at a crime scene. "It's a quilt," I said slowly. "It's laundry. It's a violation." She lowered her phone and looked at me with the kind of smile that wolves probably give to sheep right before dinner time. "You have 72 hours to remove the offending display and submit a written compliance confirmation to the HOA office. Failure to comply will result in a formal citation and potential daily fines of $50 until the violation is corrected." That's when I realized I wasn't just dealing with an overzealous HOA president. I was dealing with a woman who had turned neighborhood management into a personal crusade against anything that made her feel less powerful. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was about control. This was about a woman who had spent 8 years making sure every blade of grass in Maplewood Estates grew exactly the way she wanted it to grow. I should have taken down the quilt. I should have apologized for my grandmother's rebellious fabric choices and promised to restrict my laundry to the shadows where decent people kept their domestic activities. I should have recognized that Diane Blackthorne was a woman who collected victories like some people collect stamps, and that fighting her would be like trying to reason with a hurricane. Instead, I smiled back at her and said, "I'll take that under advisement." Something flickered across her face then, something that looked almost like surprise. I don't think anyone had ever responded to her HOA authority with anything less than immediate compliance. For just a moment, her perfectly composed mask slipped, and I caught a glimpse of the woman underneath, someone who was used to winning every single battle, no matter how small. 72 hours, Sarah," she repeated, but her voice was tighter now, more controlled. "I'd hate for this to become a larger issue." As I watched her walk back to her house, her phone already pressed to her ear, I knew she was wrong about one thing. This was already a larger issue. This was the beginning of something that would consume our neighborhood, destroy her carefully constructed authority, and turn my grandmother's quilts into the most expensive laundry in suburban history. I just didn't know yet that the woman who thought she could fine me for hanging my clothes outside was about to discover that I had inherited more than just my grandmother's fabric collection. I had inherited her complete and utter inability to back down from a fight.
The defendant has willfully and repeatedly violated Section 4.3.2 with malicious intent to disrupt community harmony. Diane's voice echoed through the community center conference room like she was prosecuting a federal case instead of discussing my grandmother's bed linens. That's when I knew this woman had lost her mind. The citation envelope was wedged so tightly into my front door that it tore when I yanked it out, leaving behind adhesive residue that would take 3 rounds of Goo Gone to remove. Inside was a formal violation notice printed on official Maplewood Estates letterhead, complete with the community logo, a cheerful maple leaf that suddenly looked more like a threat than a symbol of seasonal charm. But this wasn't just any HOA form letter. This was a masterclass in bureaucratic warfare. Diane had photographed my grandmother's quilt from 7 different angles. 7! She'd included timestamps showing exactly when each photo was taken, GPS coordinates pinpointing the location of my clothesline, and measurements indicating the precise distance from my property line to the nearest public sidewalk. She'd even calculated the square footage of visible fabric and cross-referenced it with municipal zoning ordinances about commercial signage. The woman had turned my Tuesday morning laundry routine into a forensic investigation. But here's what really got my attention. At the bottom of the 3rd page, in Diane's own handwriting, was a note that read, "Pattern of defiance established. Recommend escalation to legal committee." Legal committee? For hanging my grandmother's quilts outside to dry? You're about to discover just how deep this rabbit hole goes, because what I found next made me realize I wasn't dealing with an overzealous HOA president. I was dealing with a woman who had weaponized the entire concept of community living. I should have seen the signs earlier. 3 days after our front porch confrontation, I started noticing things. Small things that individually meant nothing, but together painted a picture of systematic harassment that would make a private investigator proud. Every morning at exactly 6:45 a.m., Diane would emerge from her house with her phone and take what appeared to be casual photos of the neighborhood. But her route always brought her past my house during her morning constitutional, and her phone was always pointed in the direction of my property. My mailbox, which had been perfectly aligned for the 8 months I'd lived there, was suddenly dangerously close to the street, according to a hand-delivered note that appeared on Thursday. My recycling bin, which I'd been putting out on the same spot every Tuesday for 34 weeks, was now improperly positioned and in violation of municipal waste management guidelines. Even my doormat, a simple brown mat that said "Welcome" in understated letters, was apparently too large for approved entryway decorations per Section 7.2.4 of the Community Guidelines. But the real masterpiece arrived on Friday morning. I was pouring my coffee when I heard the unmistakable sound of official paperwork being shoved through my mail slot. Not delivered by the regular postman, who was a pleasant guy named Eddie, who always waved when he saw me. This was the sharp, aggressive sound of someone forcing an envelope through the opening, like they were trying to breach a small fortress. The envelope contained a notice of community hearing scheduled for the following Monday at 7 p.m. in the Maplewood Estates Community Center. The subject line read, "Ongoing violations and pattern of non-compliance by resident Sarah Martinez, 1247 Maple Street." Pattern of non-compliance. The woman was building a legal case against my laundry. I spent the weekend researching everything I could about HOA law, community covenants, and the specific regulations that governed Maplewood. What I discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. Diane hadn't just memorized our 47 pages of community restrictions. She'd been systematically using them to force out residents who didn't meet her personal standards of suburban compliance. The Maplewood Estates Community Association had the legal authority to impose fines, place liens on properties, and even initiate foreclosure proceedings for serious covenant violations. In the right hands, these powers were designed to maintain property values and ensure basic community standards. In Diane's hands, they were weapons of mass suburban destruction. But here's what really chilled me to the bone. Buried in the minutes of previous HOA meetings, which were available online for any resident to review, I found evidence of Diane's systematic campaign against anyone who dared to express individuality in her perfect neighborhood. Over the past 3 years, she'd successfully forced out the Johnsons, too many cars in their driveway, the Martinez family, inappropriate garden gnomes, and the elderly Mrs. Patterson, failure to maintain adequate lawn density standards. Each case followed the same pattern: initial violation notice, escalating fines, community standards hearing, and eventual financial pressure that forced the residents to sell their homes and move somewhere with less aggressive HOA enforcement. Diane had turned our community association into her personal fiefdom, and she'd gotten away with it because most people couldn't afford to fight a legal battle over their right to hang laundry outside. Monday evening arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that makes everything look like a crime scene. I walked into the community center at exactly 6:59 p.m. and found myself facing what can only be described as a suburban tribunal. Diane sat at the head of a folding table, flanked by two other board members I vaguely recognized from previous meetings: Bob Henderson, a retired accountant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and Patricia Williamson, a sharp-faced woman in her 60s who was nodding along to every word Diane spoke like a dashboard bobblehead. "Good evening, Sarah," Diane said, gesturing to a single folding chair positioned directly across from their makeshift judicial bench. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional beige that makes you feel guilty even when you haven't done anything wrong. Diane had prepared a presentation, complete with a laptop, a portable projector, and what appeared to be a slideshow titled "Property Values and Community Compliance, a Case Study." As you can see from slide 1, she clicked through photographs of my clothesline from multiple angles. The defendant's repeated violation of Section 4.3.2 has created a visual disruption that impacts the entire neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Defendant! She was calling me a defendant in a community center conference room over my grandmother's quilts. But what happened next was when I realized this wasn't just about control or power. This was about something much more personal. Diane clicked to her next slide, and there was my grandmother's quilt in high-definition glory, with specific sections circled in red marker. Furthermore, the inappropriate messaging displayed on the violating textile contains language that contradicts our community's family-friendly values. She zoomed in on the embroidered words, "Live free or die trying," like she was highlighting evidence in a murder trial. That's when I understood that this was never going to end with me taking down my laundry. This was about a woman who couldn't tolerate the idea that someone in her perfect neighborhood might believe in living free, trying something different, or refusing to die quietly under the weight of her manufactured authority. "I see," I said slowly, looking around the room at the handful of residents who'd shown up to watch my public execution. "I see. What exactly do you propose I do about my grandmother's inappropriate messaging?" Diane smiled then, the kind of smile that probably made Marie Antoinette nervous. "Removal of all violating materials, a written apology to the community, and a compliance bond of $500 to ensure future adherence to community standards." $500 for hanging my grandmother's quilts outside to dry. That's when I knew that Diane Blackthorne had made the biggest mistake of her 8-year reign as suburban dictator. She'd picked a fight with someone who had inherited more than just vintage quilts and eccentric taste in home decor. She'd picked a fight with someone who was about to discover exactly how creative you could get with community covenants when you actually bothered to read all 47 pages.
She keeps files on everyone, Sarah. Everyone. Mrs. Chen's whispered words cut through the morning air like a confession at a murder trial. That manila folder she pressed into my hands contained enough evidence to destroy a dictator. It was Wednesday morning, 2 days after my community center tribunal, and I was retrieving my garbage bin from the curb when Mrs. Chen appeared beside me like a suburban ghost. Linda Chen had lived in Maplewood Estates for 12 years, long enough to remember when the HOA meetings were about organizing block parties instead of prosecuting laundry violations. She was 73 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and had the kind of quiet dignity that comes from surviving real hardship, not the manufactured crises of suburban politics. "Walk with me," she said, glancing nervously toward Diane's house. "But make it look casual. She watches everything from her kitchen window." We strolled down Maple Street like two neighbors discussing the weather, but Mrs. Chen's voice carried the urgency of someone who'd been waiting years to tell her story. "You think your quilt situation is bad? Let me tell you about the Hendersons." The Hendersons had been the family who lived in the Blue Colonial at the end of the cul-de-sac before I moved to the neighborhood. According to Mrs. Chen, they'd been model residents for 6 years, until their teenage son started parking his beat-up Honda Civic in their driveway instead of the garage. "Diane started with parking violations," Mrs. Chen continued, as we passed the playground where someone had obviously measured the exact distance between each swing set. Then it was noise complaints about their dog barking. Then somehow, their fence was suddenly 2 inches too tall according to a recent property survey. The fines kept coming, $50 here, $100 there, until they couldn't afford to fight anymore. She paused at the corner where Maple Street met Oak Avenue, pretending to admire someone's flower garden while she scanned the area for listening ears. "The Hendersons weren't rich people, Sarah. Jim worked at the post office, Mary was a substitute teacher. Those HOA fines ate up their savings faster than you can imagine. They sold their house for $30,000 less than it was worth just to escape before Diane could put a lien on their property." You're about to discover that this was just the beginning of Diane's systematic campaign to reshape our neighborhood into her personal vision of suburban perfection. Mrs. Chen led me to the small park at the center of our development, where a few mothers were pushing toddlers on swings and pretending not to eavesdrop on our conversation. We settled on a bench facing away from Diane's house, and that's when she pulled out the manila folder that would change everything. "I've been documenting her methods for 3 years," Mrs. Chen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every violation notice, every fine, every family she's forced out. I kept thinking someone would stop her, that the other board members would see what she was doing. But Bob Henderson is terrified of her, and Patricia Williamson thinks Diane walks on water." Inside the folder were photocopies of dozens of HOA violation notices, each one more ridiculous than the last. The Martinez family, no relation to me despite the shared surname, had been fined for excessive cultural decorations during Cinco de Mayo. The Patels had received citations for inappropriate cooking odors emanating from residential property during their son's birthday party. Even the Johnsons, an elderly white couple who'd lived there since the development was built, had been targeted for too many vehicles when their adult children visited for Christmas. But the real smoking gun was a handwritten list in Diane's unmistakable script titled Priority Compliance Issues. The list included detailed notes about specific residents she considered problematic influences on community standards. Next to my name, she'd written, "New resident, artistic tendencies, potential agitator, monitor closely for pattern violations." Artistic tendencies. The woman had profiled me based on the fact that I hung my grandmother's quilts outside to dry. "Here's what really opened my eyes," Mrs. Chen said, flipping to a section of the folder marked Financial Records. "Do you know how much money our HOA has collected in violation fines over the past 3 years? I looked at the spreadsheet she'd compiled from publicly available financial reports. The number made my stomach drop. $43,000 in violation fines, with the vast majority collected in the past 18 months as Diane's enforcement had become increasingly aggressive. Most HOAs collect maybe a few $100s a year in fines for serious violations like unauthorized construction or dangerous property conditions. We're collecting more fines money than some municipal courts. And guess who has sole discretion over how that money gets spent?" The answer was obvious, but seeing it spelled out in black and white was still shocking. Diane had effectively created a personal slush fund by manufacturing violations and forcing residents to pay fines rather than fight expensive legal battles. The money was ostensibly going towards community improvements, but somehow those improvements always seemed to involve projects that directly benefited Diane's property values or personal preferences. The new landscaping around the community center, Mrs. Chen pointed toward the elaborate flower beds visible from our bench, paid with violation fines. The decorative street lamps that happened to be positioned perfectly to illuminate Diane's evening walks, fine money. Even the upgraded security cameras that somehow all point toward the properties of residents she considers high risk for compliance issues? You guessed it. But the most chilling discovery was a series of emails Mrs. Chen had obtained through a public records request to the city planning office. Diane had been actively lobbying municipal officials to adopt stricter enforcement standards for HOA violations, essentially trying to give herself legal backing from the city government for her harassment campaigns. She's not just content with terrorizing our neighborhood, Mrs. Chen showed me printouts of Diane's correspondence with city council members. She's been positioning herself as an expert consultant on HOA management and community standards enforcement. The emails revealed Diane's long-term strategy: build a track record of successful community value enhancement in Maplewood Estates, then franchise her methods to other HOAs throughout the county. She'd been turning our neighborhood into a laboratory for suburban authoritarianism, with residents as unwilling test subjects for her theories about property value maximization through aggressive compliance enforcement. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Mrs. Chen smiled for the first time during our conversation, and suddenly she looked less like a frightened neighbor and more like a seasoned resistance fighter. "Because you're the first person who's ever fought back against one of her violation notices. Everyone else either pays the fine or moves away, but you showed up to that hearing on Monday night and didn't back down." She was right. Most residents would have taken down the quilt, paid whatever fine Diane demanded, and learned to keep their laundry hidden from public view. But my grandmother hadn't raised me to surrender to bullies, even bullies who dressed up their tyranny in the language of community standards and property values. "There's something else," Mrs. Chen said, pulling out one final document. "I've been researching the legal structure of our HOA agreement, and I found something interesting about property rights and municipal zoning laws." The document was a copy of our original community covenants from 1987, before Diane's reign of terror began. Buried in Section 12.4.7 was a clause about resident rights to reasonable enjoyment of property within established municipal guidelines. More importantly, there was language about HOA authority being subject to applicable city and county zoning regulations. Diane has been operating under the assumption that HOA covenants supersede municipal law, Mrs. Chen explained. But according to the city zoning office, that's not always true. In fact, there are several areas where municipal law specifically protects property owner rights from excessive HOA restrictions. She pointed to a specific paragraph that made my heart race with possibility. "Did you know that the city zoning code specifically permits residents to hang laundry outside as a basic property right, and that HOA restrictions on clotheslines are only enforceable if they meet strict criteria for aesthetic impact?" That's when I realized Mrs. Chen hadn't just been documenting Diane's crimes. She'd been researching the legal weapons I'd need to fight back. This quiet, unassuming woman had been preparing for war, and she'd been waiting for someone foolish enough to actually declare it. "What do you need from me?" I asked. Mrs. Chen's smile turned positively predatory. "I need you to keep hanging your laundry outside, Sarah. I need you to make Diane so angry that she overplays her hand and gives us the legal opening we've been waiting for." As we walked back toward our respective houses, I realized I wasn't just fighting for my right to dry my grandmother's quilts in the sunshine. I was fighting for every family Diane had terrorized, every neighbor she'd silenced, and every resident who'd been forced to choose between their dignity and their mortgage payments. The Underground Railroad of suburban secrets had found its conductor, and Diane Blackthorne was about to discover that some battles are worth fighting even when the stakes seem impossibly small.
The zoning permits are approved, Miss Martinez. You can install a commercial advertising structure up to 40 feet in height. The city planning official's voice on the phone sounded bored, like he approved billboard permits every day, instead of accidentally enabling suburban warfare. He had no idea what he'd just unleashed. It was 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning, and I was sitting in my kitchen surrounded by enough legal documents to choke a municipal lawyer. Property surveys, zoning maps, HOA covenants, city ordinances, and architectural plans covered every surface like evidence in a conspiracy thriller. My laptop displayed 17 different browser tabs, ranging from billboard construction requirements to municipal zoning law to how to legally spite your HOA president. 3 weeks had passed since Mrs. Chen handed me that manila folder of Diane's crimes, and I'd spent every spare moment researching the intersection of property law, municipal zoning codes, and HOA authority. What I discovered was better than I dared to hope. Diane's reign of suburban terror had a fatal flaw, and that flaw was about to become her undoing. The breakthrough came when I was reviewing the original property deeds for Maplewood Estates. Our subdivision had been built on land that was zoned for mixed residential and commercial use, meaning the original developers had retained certain commercial rights that predated the HOA covenants. More importantly, there was a small corner lot at the entrance to our neighborhood that had never been developed. A triangular piece of land that everyone assumed was municipal property, but was actually available for private purchase. You will not believe how easy it was to buy that lot without anyone in the neighborhood knowing about it. The transaction took exactly 43 days from initial inquiry to final deed transfer. The seller was a development company in Atlanta that had been carrying the property as a tax write-off for 15 years. They were so eager to get it off their books that they accepted my first offer without negotiation, $18,000 for a prime corner lot with direct highway visibility and existing utility connections. But here's the beautiful part. Because the lot technically wasn't part of Maplewood Estates subdivision, it wasn't subject to HOA covenants. It was governed entirely by city zoning law, which permitted commercial signage up to 40 feet in height, as long as the structure met basic safety and aesthetic requirements. Diane had spent so many years terrorizing residents about property values and community standards that she'd never bothered to check whether she actually had authority over every piece of visible land in our neighborhood. Her obsession with controlling every blade of grass had blinded her to the existence of a legal loophole big enough to drive a billboard truck through. The planning process became my full-time obsession. I researched billboard construction companies, municipal permit requirements, and advertising regulations with the dedication of someone planning a military campaign. Because in many ways, that's exactly what this was, a carefully orchestrated assault on the authority structure that had terrorized my neighbors for years. I found my perfect partner in crime through a company called Metro Display Solutions, owned by a guy named Rick Torino, who specialized in what he called creative advertising installations. Rick had been in the billboard business for 22 years, and he'd seen every variation of municipal politics, zoning disputes, and NIMBY complaints that suburbia could produce. "So let me get this straight, Rick," said during our first phone consultation. "You want to install a 40-foot billboard featuring photographs of your grandmother's quilts positioned to be visible from the main road into your neighborhood, specifically to annoy your HOA president?" That's a simplified version, but essentially correct. Rick laughed so hard I thought he might hang up on me. "Lady, I've installed advertisements for strip clubs, payday loan companies, and politicians, but this might be the most beautiful revenge project I've ever heard of." The technical specifications were surprisingly straightforward. A standard billboard structure with LED lighting, weather-resistant digital display panels, and remote content management capabilities. The installation would require a concrete foundation, electrical connections, and city permits for both construction and commercial signage. Total cost, $37,000, including the first year of maintenance and remote content updates. But the real genius was in the details. The billboard would be positioned at the exact angle to be visible from Diane's kitchen window, where she conducted her morning surveillance of the neighborhood. The digital display would rotate through high-resolution photographs of my grandmother's entire quilt collection, each image professionally lit and captured to showcase every detail of Elena Rodriguez's rebellious textile artistry. The crown jewel would be the Live Free or Die Trying quilt that started this entire war, displayed in 20-foot-high glory for every resident, visitor, and highway commuter to admire. 3 weeks into the planning process, I realized I needed help with the more technical aspects of my revenge campaign. That's when I called my cousin Marcus, who worked in digital marketing and had what he called an unhealthy obsession with viral content strategy. You're essentially creating a world's most expensive social media post, but if you're going to do this, you might as well do it right. We need to think about documentation, audience engagement, and maximum viral potential. Marcus suggested installing web cameras to capture real-time reactions to the billboard installation, creating social media accounts to document the entire process, and developing what he called content strategies to maximize the entertainment value of my suburban warfare. He also recommended registering domain names like MaplewoodEstatesLaundryWar.com and Grandma'sRevengeQuilt.org. Think of this as performance art. You're not just getting revenge on one terrible HOA president. You're creating a case study in how ordinary people can fight back against petty authoritarianism using nothing but property law and strategic spite. The permits came through faster than I'd expected. The city planning office had no objection to a properly constructed billboard on commercially zoned property, especially since I was paying all required fees and working with a licensed contractor. The only requirement was a public notification period, which meant posting a small sign on the property 30 days before construction began. I installed that notification sign on a Tuesday morning in May, positioning it where it would be visible to anyone driving into the neighborhood, but small enough that Diane might not notice it immediately. The sign read, "Notice of approved commercial construction. Digital advertising structure, maximum height 40 feet, estimated completion June 15th. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The sign sat there like a time bomb with a very long fuse, waiting for someone to realize what it actually meant. I watched Diane's morning surveillance routine from my kitchen window, waiting for the moment she'd spot that innocuous piece of municipal bureaucracy and understand that her world was about to change forever. The explosion came on a Wednesday morning when I was drinking coffee and reviewing the final construction timeline. I heard the unmistakable sound of expensive heels clicking rapidly across asphalt, followed by the kind of sharp intake of breath that usually precedes either a heart attack or a volcanic eruption. Through my window, I watched Diane stare at the notification sign like she was trying to decode ancient hieroglyphics. She pulled out her phone, took pictures from multiple angles, then began what appeared to be a series of increasingly frantic phone calls. Even from 50 yards away, I could see her free hand gesturing wildly as she paced back and forth in front of the sign. 20 minutes later, she was pounding on my front door with the kind of desperate urgency usually reserved for house fires or zombie apocalypses. "What is this?" she demanded, shoving her phone screen in my face. The display showed a close-up photo of the construction notification sign.
"Looks like a city permit notice," I said, examining the image with the careful attention of someone discovering it for the first time. "Don't play games with me, Sarah. What are you building on that lot?" I smiled the kind of smile that probably made Napoleon nervous right before Waterloo. "I'm installing a community appreciation display to celebrate the artistic heritage of longtime neighborhood residents." "A what?" "A 40-foot digital billboard featuring rotating photographs of my grandmother's quilts. You remember my grandmother's quilts, don't you? The ones you found so inappropriate for community standards?" Diane's face went through a series of color changes that would have been impressive at a paint store. Red to purple to an interesting shade of gray that suggested either rage or cardiac distress. "You cannot install a billboard in this neighborhood."
Ma'am, you need to move your vehicle. The crane truck needs access to the installation site. The construction foreman's voice carried across the morning air like a director calling action on the most expensive revenge movie ever filmed. Diane's Mercedes sat blocking the entrance to my billboard lot like a luxury roadblock. It was 6:23 a.m. on a Monday morning in June, and Maplewood Estates was about to become the most famous subdivision in suburban America. The installation crew had arrived at sunrise with equipment that looked like it belonged at a NASA launch: 2 crane trucks, a concrete mixer, electrical contractors, and enough steel framework to build a small skyscraper. Rick Torino supervised the operation with the professional efficiency of a man who'd installed revenge billboards in 3 different states. I watched the entire spectacle unfold from my bedroom window, coffee in hand, while Diane stood in her driveway, looking like someone who'd just realized their house was built on an active volcano. The foundation work had been completed the previous week while Diane was visiting her sister in Tampa, timing I'd carefully orchestrated through casual conversations with her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. By the time Diane returned from her trip, there was already a concrete pad with electrical connections and steel anchor points waiting for the main structure. But nothing could have prepared our neighborhood for the reality of a 40-foot billboard installation. The first crane truck positioned itself on Maple Street, its hydraulic stabilizers extending across the asphalt like mechanical spider legs. The second truck backed up to the property line, carrying prefabricated steel sections that would form the billboard's support structure. The concrete mixer rumbled in place, ready to secure the foundation bolts that would anchor my grandmother's revenge to the earth forever. You should have seen Diane's face when she realized what was actually happening. She emerged from her house at exactly 6:47 a.m., wearing her usual morning power outfit and carrying her favorite ceramic coffee mug, the one with "World's Best HOA President" printed in gold letters. I'd been timing her routine for months, and Diane was nothing if not predictable. She always started her day with coffee on the back patio, followed by her surveillance walk around the neighborhood to document any overnight violations of her authority. But this morning, instead of finding improperly positioned garbage bins or unauthorized lawn decorations, she walked directly into the middle of a full-scale construction operation that was about to transform her perfect neighborhood into a monument to her own failure. The coffee mug slipped from her fingers and shattered against her Belgian tile walkway with the kind of ceramic crash that sounds like expensive defeat. For a moment, she just stood there staring up at the growing steel framework, her mouth open in what can only be described as suburban shock and awe. Then the screaming started. "Stop! Stop right now!" Diane ran toward the construction site, waving her arms like she was trying to flag down a runaway train. "This is illegal! This is a violation of community standards! This is destroying our property values!" Rick Torino looked down from his position on the crane platform and shrugged with the practiced indifference of someone who dealt with angry neighbors in 17 different states. "Ma'am, we have all the required permits and approvals. This is a legal construction project on private property."
"I'm calling the police," Diane shouted, already dialing her phone with fingers that shook like autumn leaves. "I'm calling the city. I'm calling my lawyer." "Call whoever you want," I said, stepping out of my house with my own coffee mug, a vintage ceramic piece decorated with sunflowers that my grandmother had given me for my 16th birthday. "But I might want to read the construction permits first." I handed her copies of all the paperwork, city permits, zoning approvals, electrical certifications, and structural engineering reports. Everything was properly signed, stamped, and approved by the appropriate municipal authorities. Everything was completely legal, totally legitimate, and absolutely unstoppable. Diane's phone calls began immediately, and I could hear every word from 50 feet away because the woman apparently never learned the concept of indoor voice. She called the mayor's office, the city planning department, the police non-emergency line, and what sounded like every city council member she had on speed dial. Every conversation followed the same pattern: initial outrage, rapid-fire complaints about property values and community standards, followed by increasingly deflated responses as whoever was on the other end explained that legally constructed billboards on commercially zoned property were completely within municipal law. But the real entertainment began when the LED display panels arrived. The digital screens came in sections, each one roughly the size of a garage door and bright enough to be seen from orbit. When assembled, they would create a seamless display surface capable of showing high-definition images with the kind of vivid color saturation that makes Times Square look subdued. "Dear God," whispered Mrs. Patterson, who'd come outside to witness the spectacle. "It's going to be like living next to a drive-in movie theater." She wasn't wrong. The billboard would be visible from 3 different highways, 2 shopping centers, and approximately 40% of the houses in Maplewood Estates. Anyone driving into our neighborhood would be greeted by whatever image I chose to display on my 40-foot canvas of suburban revenge. By 9 a.m., we had our first crowd of spectators. Word travels fast in subdivisions, especially when that word involves construction equipment, screaming HOA presidents, and the kind of neighborhood drama that usually only exists in reality TV shows. Residents began gathering on their lawns, some with coffee, some with lawn chairs, all with the eager anticipation of people watching history unfold in real time. The most delicious moment came when the actual display panels were lifted into place. Rick's crew worked with military precision, each LED section sliding into position with satisfying clicks that sounded like puzzle pieces finding their perfect fit. As the billboard took shape, you could literally see Diane's worldview crumbling in real time. She stood at the edge of the construction zone, phone pressed to her ear, frantically explaining to someone, probably her lawyer, why this obvious violation of everything good and decent about suburban living had to be stopped immediately. "I don't care what the permits say. This is a residential neighborhood. We have property values to protect. We have community standards to maintain." But here's what Diane didn't know. While she'd been focused on stopping my billboard, I'd been busy with Phase 2 of Operation Fabric Fortress. Remember how I mentioned that the original property deeds included certain commercial rights that predated the HOA covenants? Well, it turns out those rights were more extensive than anyone realized. The same legal loophole that allowed my billboard also permitted other forms of community-oriented commercial activities on designated lots throughout the subdivision. And I'd been quietly purchasing those lots for the past 2 months. By 11 a.m., while Diane was still trying to find a legal way to stop my billboard, the second construction crew arrived at the lot directly opposite her house. They carried equipment for what appeared to be another major installation project, with their own permits, zoning approvals, and construction timeline. "What is that?" Diane demanded, pointing at the new construction zone with the kind of horror usually reserved for natural disasters. I smiled and handed her another set of permits. "Community garden and recreational facility, designed to celebrate the cultural heritage of neighborhood residents through hands-on educational programming."
The community garden was going to feature raised beds planted specifically with the flowers and herbs that my grandmother had grown in her own garden, the same plants that inspired the color combinations in her rebellious quilts. But the real centerpiece would be the Heritage Learning Center, a small pavilion where I plan to host workshops on traditional textile arts, sustainable living practices, and the historical significance of laundry as a form of domestic resistance. Everything would be completely legal, properly permitted, and positioned for maximum visibility from Diane's kitchen window. "This is insane," Diane whispered, staring at the permits like they were written in a foreign language. "This is impossible. This is what happens when you fine someone for hanging their grandmother's quilts outside to dry." By noon, the billboard's LED display was fully operational and ready for its first image upload. Rick handed me a tablet connected to the remote content management system, and suddenly I had control of 40 feet of high-definition revenge potential. "What's it going to be?" he asked. "The quilt that started this whole war?" I scrolled through the professional photographs Marcus had taken of my grandmother's entire collection, each image perfectly lit and color-corrected to showcase every detail of Elena Rodriguez's lifetime of textile rebellion. The Live Free or Die Trying quilt was the obvious choice. But something else caught my attention. Hidden in my grandmother's collection was a quilt I'd never seen before, something she must have made in the final years of her life. It was simpler than her other work, a plain white background with delicate blue embroidery that formed words across the center. "Every revolution begins with someone brave enough to hang their laundry outside." That's the image I selected for the billboard's debut. As the photograph materialized on the 40-foot display, sharp and bright enough to be seen from space, I realized my grandmother had been preparing me for this war long before I knew it was coming. She'd spent 7
This is Jessica Martinez reporting live from Maplewood Estates, where a dispute over laundry has escalated into what residents are calling the most expensive HOA revenge in suburban history. The Channel 7 news reporter's voice carried across our neighborhood like she was announcing the apocalypse, which, from Diane's perspective, she probably was. It started with a single tweet at 8:47 a.m. "My HOA president fined me for hanging my grandmother's quilts outside, so I installed a 40-foot billboard of them visible from 3 highways. Thread." Attached was a photo of my billboard displaying Elena's revolutionary quilt message with Diane's house clearly visible in the foreground. By 10:30 a.m., the tweet had 6,000 retweets and was trending under hashtag #LaundryWar. By noon, I was fielding calls from local news stations, national media outlets, and something called the Suburban Drama Podcast Network that apparently existed specifically to document HOA conflicts across America. The story had everything modern media loves: petty authority figures, grassroots rebellion, and visual spectacle that photographed beautifully for social media. You will not believe how quickly this exploded into a full-scale media circus. The first news van arrived while I was having lunch, followed by a second van, then a third, until our quiet cul-de-sac looked like the scene of a major crime or a minor civil war. Reporters set up cameras with our billboard as the backdrop, interviewing anyone willing to talk about life under Diane's HOA regime. And suddenly, everyone was willing to talk. Mrs. Chen became the star witness, producing her manila folder of documented violations like evidence in a war crimes tribunal. "This woman has terrorized our neighborhood for years," she told Channel 7's cameras, her quiet dignity transformed into righteous anger. "Sarah Martinez is the first person brave enough to fight back." The Henderson family drove down from their new neighborhood 2 counties away just to be interviewed about their forced exodus from Maplewood Estates. Jim Henderson, the former postal worker, stood in front of my billboard and explained how Diane's escalating fines had cost them their dream home and their children's school district.
"We lost everything because our teenager's car didn't meet her aesthetic standards," Mary Henderson said, tears visible on camera. "We're here today because someone finally had the courage to expose what's been happening to families like ours." But the real media gold came when reporters tried to interview Diane herself. She emerged from her house at 1:15 p.m. wearing what appeared to be a carefully selected media crisis outfit: conservative navy blazer, neutral slacks, and the kind of practiced smile that politicians use when they're about to lie to your face. She'd obviously spent the morning preparing for this moment, probably rehearsing sound bites about property values and community standards. The interview lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds before Diane's carefully constructed public image imploded on live television. "Mrs. Blackthorne," began Jessica Martinez from Channel 7, "can you explain why the HOA felt it was necessary to fine a resident for hanging laundry outside?" "The Maplewood Estates Community Association is committed to maintaining property values and aesthetic standards that benefit all residents. Our community guidelines exist to protect the investment that every homeowner has made in this neighborhood. But we're talking about quilts made by the resident's grandmother, textiles with historical and sentimental value, correct?" That's when Diane made the mistake that would define her legacy in suburban America. "The specific nature of the display is irrelevant," she said, her voice taking on the cold authority that had terrorized residents for years. "Rules are rules, and they must be applied equally to all residents regardless of their personal circumstances or emotional attachments to their violations." The reporter's eyebrows rose in what I can only describe as professional delight. "So you're saying that the sentimental value of a grandmother's handmade quilts is irrelevant when it comes to HOA enforcement?" "Absolutely. Community standards cannot be compromised by individual preferences or family sentiment." You could literally see the moment when Diane realized she'd just said something catastrophically stupid on live television. Her practiced smile flickered like a dying light bulb, but it was too late. The damage was done, recorded in high definition, and already being uploaded to news websites across the country. The interview continued for another few minutes, with Diane digging herself deeper into a hole of suburban authoritarianism while trying to justify why hanging laundry outside threatened the very foundations of civilized society. Every answer made her sound more tyrannical, more out of touch, and more like a cartoon villain from a movie about HOA horror stories. Meanwhile, my phone was ringing constantly with opportunities I never imagined. "Miss Martinez, this is Dave Kowalski from Great Plains Outdoor Advertising. We'd like to discuss renting space on your billboard for legitimate commercial advertisements. Are you interested in turning this into a revenue-generating venture?" The billboard rental offers were just the beginning. By 3 p.m., I'd received calls from 17 different advertising companies, each offering increasingly absurd amounts of money to display their clients' messages on my 40-foot canvas of suburban revenge. A local car dealership wanted to pay me $3,000 a month to advertise their summer sales event. A personal injury law firm offered $5,000 monthly for rotating ads about HOA legal disputes. Even a national fast food chain called about featuring my billboard in their upcoming Local Flavor advertising campaign. But the most interesting call came from Marcus, who'd been monitoring the social media explosion from his office in downtown Atlanta. "Sarah, you need to see the numbers," he said, his voice crackling with excitement. "Your Twitter thread has 47,000 retweets. The hashtag Laundry War is trending in 6 different cities. Someone started a GoFundMe to help cover your billboard costs, and it's already raised $18,000 from complete strangers who want to support your fight against HOA tyranny." The GoFundMe was titled, "Help Sarah Fight HOA Bullies with Grandmother's Quilts," and included a detailed explanation of Diane's harassment campaign, complete with photographs of the violation notices and Mrs. Chen's documentation. Donations were pouring in from across the country, each one accompanied by messages from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. "My HOA fined me $200 for having the wrong color mailbox. You're fighting for all of us." Jennifer from Phoenix, $50 donation. "They made us tear down our kids' treehouse because it wasn't architecturally consistent. Keep fighting." The Rodriguez family from Austin, $100 donation. "I lost my house because of HOA fines over my vegetable garden. Make them pay." Anonymous from Seattle, $500 donation. Reading these messages, I realized my billboard wasn't just about personal revenge anymore. It had become a symbol of resistance for anyone who'd ever been bullied by petty suburban authority figures who confused community leadership with personal dictatorship. The media attention reached critical mass around 4 p.m. when CNN called to request a live satellite interview for their evening news program. Suddenly, my grandmother's quilts were about to become part of the national conversation about property rights, community governance, and the limits of HOA authority. But Diane wasn't finished fighting. At 4:30 p.m., just as I was preparing for my CNN interview, she launched her counterattack. A new construction crew appeared on Maple Street, this one carrying equipment that looked suspiciously like they were preparing to install something directly between my billboard and the main road into the neighborhood. "What is that?" I asked Mrs. Chen, who'd positioned herself on her front porch like a suburban intelligence operative. "Looks like she's trying to install some kind of screening structure, maybe a fence or landscaping barrier to block the view of your billboard." I walked over to investigate, followed by 3 news cameras and a growing crowd of neighbors who'd gathered to watch the latest development in our suburban war. The construction crew was indeed preparing to install what appeared to be an elaborate privacy fence, complete with decorative panels designed to block the view of my billboard from the street. "Excuse me," I said to the construction foreman. "Do you have permits for this installation?" The man looked uncomfortable, glancing toward Diane's house before answering. "Ma'am, we're working under an emergency beautification order from the HOA Architectural Review Committee." Emergency beautification order? That's when Diane appeared, flanked by Bob Henderson and Patricia Williamson, like she was leading a suburban military campaign. She carried a folder of official-looking documents and wore the kind of satisfied smile that suggested she'd found the perfect loophole to shut down my revenge billboard. "Sarah," she announced loud enough for the news cameras to capture every word, "the Architectural Review Committee has determined that your billboard constitutes a visual pollution hazard that requires immediate mitigation under Section 8.4.
The Maplewood Estates Community Association hereby formally apologizes to all residents who were subjected to excessive enforcement actions during the previous administration." Bob Henderson's voice trembled as he read the official statement during our first post-Diane HOA meeting. It was exactly what I'd waited 8 months to hear. The meeting was held on a crisp October evening in the same community center conference room where Diane had once prosecuted me for hanging my grandmother's quilts outside. But instead of facing a suburban tribunal, I was sitting among neighbors who'd become allies, friends, and fellow revolutionaries in the most successful HOA coup in subdivision history. The changes had begun within 24 hours of the county tax investigation. Diane's financial records revealed what Mrs. Chen had suspected all along: systematic misuse of violation fines, undocumented community improvement expenses that somehow always benefited her property, and a pattern of selective enforcement that bordered on harassment. Inspector Williams' audit uncovered enough irregularities to trigger a full investigation by the county attorney's office. But Diane didn't wait for the legal process to play out.
on a Thursday morning in July, 2 weeks after my billboard made national news, she submitted her resignation letter and put her house on the market. By August, she was gone, relocated to a gated community in South Carolina, where, according to neighborhood rumors, she was already campaigning for a position on their architectural review committee. You should have seen the celebration when the for sale sign appeared on her lawn. The Hendersons organized a block party that lasted until midnight, complete with a potluck dinner and what they called a freedom bonfire, featuring printed copies of Diane's most ridiculous violation notices. Mrs. Chen brought homemade dumplings and stories about residents who'd been too intimidated to fight back during the Reign of Terror. Even the elderly Mr. Patterson emerged from his house to share tales of the neighborhood's pre-Diane era, when HOA meetings were about organizing charity drives instead of prosecuting laundry violations. But the real transformation began when we held elections for a new HOA board. The campaign was unlike anything our subdivision had ever experienced. Instead of the usual unopposed incumbents rubber-stamping each other's authority, we had actual candidates with actual platforms, focused on community building rather than community control. Mrs. Chen ran for president on a platform of reasonable governance and community fellowship. Jim Henderson returned from his exile to campaign for treasurer, promising transparent financial management and an end to punitive fine structures. Even Marcus drove down from Atlanta to help organize a social media campaign that turned our HOA election into a model for suburban democracy. The results weren't even close. Mrs. Chen won the presidency with 87% of the vote, carrying every precinct except the empty lot where Diane's house used to stand. The new board was sworn in on a Tuesday evening in September, and their first official act was to vote on Resolution 2023-001, the elimination of punitive community restrictions and the restoration of reasonable property rights. The resolution passed unanimously. Within 30 days, the new board had eliminated or substantially modified 43 of the 47 pages of community restrictions that Diane had accumulated during her 8-year reign. Gone were the bans on clotheslines, wind chimes, vegetable gardens, and culturally inappropriate decorations. Gone were the restrictions on vehicle types, visitor parking, and mailbox colors. Gone was the Architectural Review Committee's authority to fine residents for aesthetic violations that harmed nobody except Diane's vision of suburban perfection. But the most satisfying change was the new policy on community fines. They could only be imposed for violations that posed actual safety hazards or violated municipal law, and any fine over $50 required a majority vote of the entire HOA membership. Meanwhile, my billboard had evolved from a tool of revenge into a legitimate business venture that was funding the neighborhood's renaissance. The rotating advertising space generated enough monthly revenue to cover my mortgage payments and fund community improvements that actually improved the community. Great Plains Outdoor Advertising had signed a 3-year contract, and my 40-foot display now featured everything from local restaurant promotions to public service announcements about voter registration. But every Tuesday morning, without fail, the billboard displayed the same image: my grandmother's Live Free or Die Trying quilt, accompanied by text that read, "Maplewood Estates, where community means freedom." The community garden had become the neighborhood's crown jewel. Built on the lot adjacent to my billboard, it featured raised beds planted with flowers and vegetables that reflected the cultural heritage of our residents. Mrs. Chen grew bok choy and Chinese herbs. The Rodriguez family cultivated a section devoted to traditional Mexican peppers and healing plants. The new residents who'd moved into Diane's former house, a young couple with 2 small children, had planted a butterfly garden that attracted monarchs during their autumn migration. The Heritage Learning Center Pavilion held workshops every Saturday morning, covering everything from traditional quilting techniques to sustainable gardening practices to the historical significance of domestic resistance. My grandmother's complete quilt collection was displayed in rotating exhibits, each piece accompanied by stories about the European villages where she'd learned different textile techniques. But the real magic happened during our weekly laundry solidarity gatherings every Tuesday morning, when neighbors brought their washing outside to dry in the sunshine while sharing coffee, stories, and the kind of community connection that Diane's rules had been designed to prevent. "You know what's funny?" Mrs. Chen said during one of these gatherings, gesturing toward the clotheslines that now decorated yards throughout our subdivision. She was so worried about property values, but the real estate agent told me our neighborhood is now one of the most desirable in the county. People want to live in a community where they can actually express themselves. She was right. Property values in Maplewood Estates had increased by an average of 12% since Diane's departure, making our subdivision one of the fastest appreciating residential areas in the region. Apparently, prospective homeowners were willing to pay a premium for the freedom to hang their laundry outside, plant vegetable gardens, and live without fear of being fined for expressing their individuality. The story had continued to generate national attention long after the initial media circus. My billboard appeared in documentaries about HOA overreach, academic studies about suburban governance, and at least 3 different books about grassroots resistance movements. I'd been invited to speak at conferences about property rights, community organizing, and what one urban planning professor called the democratization of neighborhood authority structures. But my favorite recognition came from an unexpected source, the National Association of Community Fabric Artists, which presented me with their annual Revolutionary Textile Award for outstanding achievement in the field of domestic rebellion through creative cloth display. The ceremony was held at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where my grandmother's Live Free or Die Trying quilt was being considered for permanent inclusion in their collection of American folk art. Standing in that museum, surrounded by artifacts from actual revolutionary movements, I realized that my grandmother had been right all along. Every revolution does begin with someone brave enough to hang their laundry outside, to express their individuality in the face of arbitrary authority, to choose freedom over compliance with rules designed to diminish rather than elevate the human spirit. 6 months after Diane's departure, I still hung my laundry on the line every Tuesday morning. Not because I had to prove a point anymore, but because there's something profoundly satisfying in watching your clothes dry in the sunshine, while knowing that your community supports your right to do so. The morning sun still caught water drops like diamonds. My billboard still stood sentinel over our subdivision, now advertising a local farmer's market instead of broadcasting suburban warfare. Children played in yards where their parents no longer feared citations for excessive recreational noise. Neighbors gathered in gardens where vegetables grew without violating anyone's aesthetic standards. And every time I walked past the empty lot where Diane's house used to stand, now converted into a community playground where kids built tree houses without Architectural Review Committee approval, I smiled and whispered the same words my grandmother had embroidered on that first rebellious quilt: "Live free or die trying." Because sometimes the best revenge isn't just exposing a tyrant's weakness or watching their empire crumble. Sometimes the best revenge is building something so much better in its place that future generations will never understand how anyone ever thought the old way was acceptable. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to make your world smaller than it actually is, even if that step is as simple as hanging your grandmother's quilts outside to dry.